That phone screen isn't a real boarding pass.
Show me a paper ticket.
It's the airline app. Scan it at the podium. Don't turn this into something it's not.
First class?
You expect me to believe you paid for that. Hand it over again.
I'm Special Agent Marcus Thorne, IRS CI. Verify my credentials right now or you're obstructing the federal agent.
Special Agent Marcus Thorne, a man whose 22-year career with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division was built on a foundation of patience and forensic precision, stood like a rock in the churning river of humanity at Gate D34 of Miami International Airport. The morning sun, usually a cheerful harbinger of a Florida day, instead slanted through the massive terminal windows to illuminate a scene of controlled chaos. A last-minute aircraft change for the 9:05 a.m. flight to Atlanta had thrown the boarding process into disarray. Gate agents were frazzled, their voices strained over the PA system, and a crowd of anxious travelers pressed forward a chaotic mosaic of rolling bags and nervous energy. At 52, Thorne had seen it all. He'd stared down cartel money launderers and dismantled intricate tax evasion schemes orchestrated by men who thought they were gods. The disorganized shuffle of a gate change was an inconvenience, not a crisis. He leaned against a pillar, his 6'2" frame clad in a tailored navy blazer and gray trousers, looking every bit the seasoned federal professional. On his tablet, he calmly reviewed the encrypted files of a multi-million-dollar fraud case, his mind already in Atlanta, preparing for a high-stakes interview that afternoon. He was so focused he barely noticed the approach of the man who was about to mistake his composure for a crime. Officer Evan Riley of the Airport Police Division was 31 years old, and he walked with the kind of rigid swagger that often belongs to men who feel their authority is constantly being tested. In his 4 years on the force, he'd amassed a troubling number of citizen complaints, most of them alleging an overly aggressive confrontational style, particularly with minority travelers. He saw the airport not as a place of transit and reunion, but as a territory to be controlled, a stage for his vigilance. As he strode through the agitated crowd at D34, his eyes scanned for anything or anyone that seemed out of place in his rigid worldview. He wasn't looking for actual threats. He was looking for deviations from his own internal script. His gaze swept past a hurried businessman, a family with crying children, and then it landed on Marcus Thorne. A tall, impeccably dressed black man standing calmly apart from the fray looking at a tablet. To Riley, Thorne's tranquility in the midst of the terminal's storm was not a sign of a seasoned traveler, but a red flag. It was too calm, too confident. In Riley's mind, it was suspicious. He adjusted his duty belt and altered his course, a predator locking onto prey, convinced he had found the one person in this entire chaotic scene who truly didn't belong. The gate agent's voice crackled over the loudspeaker, announcing a new boarding procedure that only added to the confusion. It was during this scramble that Officer Riley made his move, stepping directly into Marcus Thorne's personal space. "Gonna need to see your boarding pass," Riley said, his voice clipped, foregoing any pleasantry. Thorne looked up from his tablet, his focus shifting from financial fraud to the uniformed officer in front of him. "Of course, officer," he replied, his tone even. He navigated to the airline's app and pulled up the digital boarding pass displaying the QR code and his first-class seat assignment 2A. He held the screen out for Riley to inspect. Riley squinted at the phone, his expression a mask of exaggerated suspicion. "This isn't a real boarding pass," he declared, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "This is just a picture on a phone." Thorne's years of de-escalation training kicked in. "It's the airline's mobile app, officer. It's how most people fly these days. They'll scan it right there at the podium." Riley shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips. "I know a fraudulent document when I see one. Anyone can mock up a picture. I need to see a paper ticket." A few nearby travelers glanced over, their curiosity piqued by the officer's accusatory tone. "I don't have a paper ticket," Thorne explained patiently. "The airline issued it digitally. I can assure you it's perfectly valid." Riley leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial growl. "First class, huh? You sure you can afford a ticket like that?" The question hung in the air, thick with insinuation. It wasn't about the boarding pass anymore. It was about a black man in a blazer whose presence in the first-class line didn't compute in Officer Riley's biased mind. Do you think airport police need more intensive training on modern travel technology and de-escalation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thorne felt a familiar cold knot tighten in his stomach, the same feeling he'd gotten countless times over the years in situations just like this. He was no longer a respected federal agent. He was just another black man being questioned about his right to exist in a certain space. Thorne kept his voice steady, refusing to take the bait. His composure, honed over 2 decades of high-pressure investigations, was his shield. Officer, my ability to afford the ticket is not the issue here. The issue is that you are mistaken about this boarding pass. It is legitimate. He even gestured toward the gate agent. If you have concerns, you're welcome to ask the airline staff. They can verify my ticket in their system in about 10 seconds. This offer of a simple, logical solution seemed to infuriate Riley even more. To him, Thorne's calm and rational demeanor wasn't cooperation. It was defiance. It was the condescending tone of someone who thought they were smarter than him. I don't need to ask them. Riley snapped, his voice rising again. I'm the police here. I'm telling you this is a fake and you're trying to get access to a secure area with a fraudulent document. The scene was now attracting significant attention. Conversations hushed. People who had been absorbed in their own travel anxieties turned to watch the confrontation unfold. The accusation was absurd, and everyone knew it. Digital boarding passes were the norm. Yet the officer was doubling down, his face reddening with a mixture of anger and self-righteousness. Sir, Thorne said, his voice taking on a harder edge, you are interfering with my travel for a federal law enforcement matter. I suggest you reconsider your next words very carefully. The mention of federal law enforcement should have been a stop sign, a moment for any reasonable officer to pause and reassess. For Riley, it was gasoline on a fire. He saw it as a desperate bluff. Oh, a federal matter, is it? He sneered. Now you're impersonating an officer on top of everything else. That's a felony. He took a half-step back, placing his hand on his hip near his service weapon. I've had enough of your games. You have 2 choices. You can leave the gate area immediately, or I can arrest you for trespassing and interfering with airport security. What's it going to be? Marcus Thorne had spent his career navigating complex situations, knowing precisely when to observe and when to act. This was a moment for decisive action. He had tried reason. He had tried patience. He had been met with profiling and threats. He knew that complying and leaving would only validate the officer's prejudice. He also knew that this entire encounter was a catastrophic failure of policing that needed to be documented from the top down. You're making a tremendous mistake, officer, Thorne said, his voice low and clear, cutting through the terminal noise. He looked Riley directly in the eye, holding his gaze. I told you I was on a federal law enforcement matter. I am a federal agent. With a slow, deliberate movement designed to be non-threatening, Thorne reached inside his blazer. Riley tensed his hand, dropping to the grip of his sidearm. Don't you do it, he warned. Thorne ignored him, his movements fluid and practiced. He withdrew a black leather credential case. He flipped it open, revealing the heavy gold shield of the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and next to it his identification card, Special Agent Marcus Thorne, IRS Criminal Investigation. He held it out for Riley to see. Read it, Thorne commanded, his voice devoid of anger but filled with an authority that Riley had never truly possessed. Special Agent, Internal Revenue Service. I am on official duty and you are obstructing a federal officer. For a brief second, a flicker of doubt crossed Riley's face, but his bias was a wall too thick for reason to penetrate. He had already decided who Marcus Thorne was: a fraud, a man who didn't belong. The reality of the credentials in front of him was too much for his ego to accept. He scoffed a short, ugly sound of disbelief. Nice try. Very good fake, he said, waving a dismissive hand. You can buy those things online. I'm not falling for it. How should a legitimate officer react when presented with federal credentials? Should immediate verification be a mandatory policy? Share your opinion below. The moment Riley dismissed the credentials as fake, the situation crossed a critical threshold. Thorne knew there was no talking his way out of it. The officer's mind was closed, sealed shut by prejudice. "Officer," Thorne said, his voice now a cold, hard instrument of fact. "My badge number is 7421. I am based out of the Washington field office. My supervisor's name is on this card. You have an obligation to verify." But Riley wasn't listening. "I have an obligation to secure this airport," he shot back. "You're done. Put your hands behind your back." As Riley reached for his handcuffs, the dynamic of the crowd shifted. Several passengers who had been watching with a mixture of shock and disbelief raised their cell phones. The soft red dots of recording indicators blinked on across the gate area. A young woman standing 10 feet away spoke up, her voice trembling but clear. "He didn't do anything. I've been standing right here. He just showed you his phone." An older man in a business suit added, "Officer, this is ridiculous. Everyone uses those QR codes." The sight of the recording phones and the passengers speaking up seemed to rattle Riley, but instead of backing down, he felt cornered, which made him more aggressive. The commotion, however, had finally reached the ears of someone with sense. Sergeant Daniels, a 25-year veteran of the airport force with a weary face and eyes that had seen it all, came striding toward the gate. "Riley, what the hell is going on here?" He barked, his voice carrying the instant authority Riley lacked. Riley, momentarily flustered, turned to his supervisor. "Sarge, this guy is trying to get through security with a fake boarding pass. Now he's showing me a fake badge claiming to be some kind of Fed." Daniel's eyes fell on Thorne, who was still standing calmly, his credentials held out. Daniels walked past. Riley took the leather case from Thorne's hand and examined it. Unlike Riley, he didn't just glance. He looked. He felt the weight of the badge, saw the official hologram on the ID, and read the name. His expression changed from annoyed to deeply concerned. "I'll be right back," he said to Thorne, his tone respectful. He turned to Riley. "Don't you move a muscle." Daniels walked swiftly to the gate podium, picked up the desk phone, and dialed the airport's federal liaison desk. The phone call was brief. Sergeant Daniels spoke in low, urgent tones, reading Thorne's name and badge number into the receiver. The entire gate area was now silent, a captive audience to the slow-motion implosion of an officer's career. Officer Riley stood frozen, a sudden sweat beading on his forehead as the reality of his actions began to dawn on him. He watched his supervisor on the phone, saw him nod, and then saw the color drain from his face. Daniels hung up the phone and walked back his steps, heavy with purpose. He didn't look at Riley. He walked directly to Marcus Thorne and handed him back his credentials. "Special Agent Thorne," Daniels said, his voice filled with a gravity that bordered on apology. "My sincerest apologies for my officer's conduct. Your status is confirmed. Please proceed with your travel. We will escort you to the aircraft to ensure no further delay." Then Sergeant Daniels turned to face Officer Riley, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. His voice was no longer loud, but a cold, quiet fury that was far more terrifying. "Riley, you are a disgrace." He pointed a trembling finger at him. "You harassed a citizen. You ignored clear evidence. And you nearly arrested a senior federal agent on official business after he properly identified himself." Riley began to stammer. "Sarge, I thought the credentials looked—" Daniels cut him off with a slice of his hand. "You didn't think that's your problem. You saw what you wanted to see. Unbuckle your belt, now." In front of the silent crowd of travelers and their recording phones, a humiliated Evan Riley slowly unbuckled his duty belt and handed it along with his sidearm to his sergeant. "You are on administrative leave effective immediately," Daniels declared. "An escort will walk you to your locker and then off the property. We'll talk about your future employment on Monday, but I wouldn't be optimistic." As another officer arrived to lead the disgraced Riley away, Marcus Thorne simply gave a curt nod to Sergeant Daniels and walked toward the jet bridge, the hushed whispers of the passengers following him. By the time Special Agent Thorne's flight landed in Atlanta, the videos were already a national story. Uploaded from a dozen different angles, the footage was undeniable and infuriating. The clips titled with captions like, "Airport Cop Tries to Arrest Black IRS Agent Over Boarding Pass," and "Power-Tripping Cop Refuses to Believe Federal Badge is Real," had exploded across every social media platform. The outrage was instantaneous and overwhelming. News outlets picked up the story, plastering Officer Riley's face next to screenshots of Thorne's calm, professional demeanor. The airport authorities' public relations department was buried under an avalanche of furious emails and calls demanding action. The incident had touched a raw nerve, perfectly encapsulating the daily indignities and dangers of racial profiling. It was a textbook example of how a black man's success and authority could be rendered invisible by an officer's bias. The backlash forced the airport police department to act swiftly. The internal investigation, which under normal circumstances might have been a slow bureaucratic process designed to exonerate the officer, was conducted with unprecedented speed and transparency. What they found was damning. In just 4 years of service, Officer Evan Riley had accumulated 7 prior citizen complaints, 5 alleged racial profiling, and 2 alleged excessive force. All 7 had been investigated superficially and dismissed labeled unfounded or unsubstantiated, despite witness statements in several cases. A clear pattern of behavior had been ignored. Riley was an accident waiting to happen, a lawsuit in a blue uniform, and the department's failure to act on the clear warning signs had now resulted in a public relations catastrophe and a severe breach of professional conduct. It was a systemic failure, a culture of protecting problematic officers until their misconduct became too public to ignore. Is it enough to fire one bad officer, or does a pattern of ignored complaints point to a deeper systemic problem in leadership? Drop your answer. The legal and professional consequences were swift. Officer Evan Riley was terminated less than a week after the incident. His name was forwarded to the National Decertification Index, ensuring his career in law enforcement was permanently over. Faced with irrefutable video evidence and a documented history of negligence in supervising Riley, the city, and the airport authority knew a court battle was unwinnable. When Special Agent Marcus Thorne filed a formal civil rights lawsuit for unlawful detention violation of his constitutional rights and racial profiling, their attorneys immediately moved to settle. The final figure was substantial, a public admission of their culpability. Peak Street Coffee issued a public apology and announced new policies prohibiting calls to police based on customer complaints, unless there was actual criminal behavior. But for Thorne, it was never about the money. It was about accountability. It was about exposing a system that allowed a man like Riley to wield a badge and a gun. Back at his desk in the Washington field office a few weeks later, Marcus Thorne looked down at the credentials that Officer Riley had dismissed as a fake. The gold Treasury shield felt heavy in his hand, a symbol of a career he had dedicated his life to. He had spent 22 years pursuing complex financial criminals, men and women who hid their crimes behind layers of shell corporations and digital ledgers. He was respected by prosecutors, valued by his colleagues, and trusted with the nation's most sensitive financial investigations. And yet, in that airport terminal, none of it had mattered. In the eyes of one police officer, his suit, his calm demeanor, and even his federal badge were just part of an elaborate costume. His real identity, the only one that registered in Riley's mind, was the color of his skin. The settlement was a victory, and Riley's termination was justice. But it was a hollow feeling. Thorne thought about all the times he'd been followed in stores, the times he'd been stopped for driving his Lexus in a nice neighborhood, the countless small cuts of a life lived as a black man in America. He had always believed his position, his authority afforded him some layer of protection. That day in Miami had stripped that illusion away. It was a bitter, painful reminder that a uniform and a biased mind could be more powerful than a federal shield. The real question wasn't about what happened to him, but what happens every single day to people who don't have a badge to fall back on. What happens to the young man, the college student, the father who can't produce a symbol of federal authority to save them? Their encounters don't end with a settlement. They end in handcuffs, or worse. What does it say about our system when a federal agent's credentials are seen as less valid than an officer's prejudice? How do we begin to repair a culture where authority is so often abused based on the color of someone's skin? Stories like this one are a start, but the conversation has to continue in our homes and in our communities. If you believe that accountability is the first step toward justice, please share this story and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps ensure these vital conversations are heard.